Tomorrow, the committee votes. The result is not in doubt. Gorbachev will win. But there are still plenty of questions for Crossfire to bat around. Gorbachev says he sees the future for the Communist Party, competing among equals, and a future for communism as an economic system. Is he kidding? Is he nuts? What's his game plan for staying in power? And will it work? Gorbachev says it's the new improved Soviet Union starting today. But what will it really be like? Pat?
Mr. Zviagin up there in New York, what we saw in Moscow yesterday, 200,000 people outside the Kremlin calling for change in the system, looked very much like what we saw in Berlin and in Prague 3 months ago. Is there a possibility that the Soviet Communist Party could be overthrown by the people in the streets?
Pat, I don't think there is any resemblance between the two or the three events. What we witnessed yesterday in Moscow was not exactly a pro-Gorbachev or an anti-Gorbachev rally. That was a rally for change in the country, in the pace of the democratic reforms, and of course in the radical changes across the country economically. It's a rally which was not really a threat to the party. It was not really a threat to the system, social system as such. It was a powerful reminder to the people in the government, in the Soviet parliament, that popular sentiment is growing wary of the talking and is really calling for action.
Well, let me talk to you about what does appear to be a significant threat to the party. Mr. Gorbachev has, in effect, called for repeal of Article 6 of the Constitution, which gives the Communist Party the monopoly of power throughout society. Secondly, on March 5th, nationwide elections are expected, and the Communist Party is expected to be defeated. Then there are elections scheduled in the Baltic republics, Georgia, places like that, in which the party is also expected to be defeated by independence movements. How many of these hammer blows can the parties take and still survive?
Pat, we are witnessing the factory emergence of political parties all across the Soviet Union. In fact, there are 2 communist parties in Lithuania alone. There are many de facto parties in Russia, in the Caucasus. I think what we're witnessing today is the gradual emergence of the multi-party system in which the Communist Party will play a major, but maybe not a very decisive role, a powerful role for that matter. And I think that, again, we are not witnessing the downfall of the Communist Party. We're witnessing an emergence of a new and much more democratic system in the Soviet Union.
Professor Goldman, what does the Communist Party think it's doing, completely apart from what may happen? What does it mean to say they're giving up their monopoly on power? Do they actually contemplate multi-party systems? Do they actually contemplate an election which they could lose, in which they could lose power?
Well, I think that you've got to distinguish between some people in the party and Gorbachev. I think Gorbachev thinks that indeed probably it might be time to have more than one party. As you've just heard, in different republics there are indeed several parties, including Estonia, where there's a monarchist party of all things. But there are some people within the Communist Party who are very upset about these tendencies, don't want it to change because it means they're going to lose their power, they're going to lose their stature, and some of them still believe in communism after all, and that communism should be the dominant party.
But if the Central Committee votes this multi-party system tomorrow, and then next they have their meeting, the whole party meeting next June, and it votes to accept these changes, does that mean they have accepted democracy as we understand it, or is it something less than that?
Well, it's keep the parties separate. Where I think you've seen the democracy is in the Supreme Soviet. Last March, there were elections, there were contests, and they were very meaningful. Within the party, there is still a lot of heavy-handedness going on, and there probably will be afterwards. Even if the Communist Party votes to do away with Article 6, to allow other parties to contend, my feeling is that the Communist Party in the Soviet Union will probably continue to be a very strong organization, not like in Eastern Europe, where communism was inflicted on the people by the Soviet government. Communism in the Soviet Union, in a sense, came from within, was undoubtedly imposed on some of the people, but was imposed by Russians.
All right, Mr. Zviagin, as you know, the independence movement is very strong in Lithuania. It's strong in the Baltic republics. Moldavia wants, in a way, to rejoin Romania. It was taken from Romania in the Hitler-Stalin Pact, or in its aftermath. Do you think that Mr. Gorbachev and the party will permit these independence movements, if elected, which it appears they're going to be, or winning these ballots, to come to power and gradually leave the Soviet Union? If they democratically decide to go, will Moscow let them?
Pat, in the first place, I don't think that any reasonable or sane politician or an economist today would really vie for separating from the Soviet Union in the face of Europe gradually tightening together economically, politically, socially, and so on. I think what we're witnessing today is a gradual restructuring of the Soviet Union into a federation of sorts, and no one really knows what form it will take. And Gorbachev, in fact, is opting for this primarily, and that's why he's calling for a more powerful parliament, for more power in the office of the president of the country. And that's what I understand he's going to take over sometime in the fall.
Let me put that to Marshall Goldman.
I disagree.
All right, Professor Goldman, do you think, first, that the independence movements will win in the Baltics and elsewhere? Secondly, that they will decide to leave? And third, will Moscow let them go?
In the first place, I think they will decide to leave. It doesn't mean they're reasonable or unreasonable. Right now, this is a romantic period. They see history moving in the sense of diminishing the power of the Russian Republic inside the Soviet Union. They want very much to separate. It may not make sense. I think I would agree there. But that doesn't matter. They see themselves, if left in the Soviet Union, sinking. They won't have a country like Sweden, but they think they'll be better off on their own. Will Gorbachev let it take place? I don't know. He went up there to argue. He seemed initially to be very upset with the whole idea. He seemed to compromise. But when it came to a showdown in Azerbaijan, when indeed the people were moving away, he sent in troops, and it was a very violent thing. They kept all the cameras out, but we know from the aftermath that many people were killed, over 100 people were killed, and it was a very bloody affair. When Gorbachev said, are they going to go out or not, he said, no, they're not going to go out and we're going to send troops.
Marshall, let me ask you, Marshall, how would you then explain the fact that the next morning after Mr. Gorbachev left, Mr. Brazauskas, the leader of the Lithuanian Communist Party, was elected president of that republic? It means that communists are still a powerful force and a popular force in the republic.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, what he's trying to do is to get ahead of the movement. I mean, but Gorbachev was arguing with him not to let the Communist Party do this. But it doesn't mean that the Communist Party in Lithuania is necessarily going to follow the orders of the party in Moscow, and indeed there seems to be the case that the Communist Party of Lithuania is indeed part of the process to move out of the Soviet Union and form their own separate country. They're talking about issuing their own money as of January 1st, and that in itself is a de facto form of separation from the Soviet Union.
Mr. Zviagin, the CNN reported last week and is feeling a bit embarrassed right now that Gorbachev was going to quit as head of the party. Was this really wrong, or was this merely premature? Is this something he's going to do in the next few weeks?
I think it was premature, primarily because Mr. Gorbachev himself talked about separating this dual position sometime later, maybe this year, maybe next year. But it will be the Parliament and the Congress of People's Deputies who will decide this issue, not really the Congress of the Communist Party or the plenum tomorrow. I think Mr. Gorbachev will eventually do it, as I said, primarily because in a position as president, he will be in a better position to implement many of the ideas of perestroika and will not be affected as much as today by the internal party politicking.
Professor Goldman, can we get you on that issue, on Gorbachev and the party?
I don't mean to be a nitpicker, but the party situation is going to be determined by the Central Committee and Gorbachev within the committee. The Congress of People's Deputies in the Supreme Soviet is a government organization, and they're going to presumably look at Gorbachev as the president, and he's got another 4 years left to serve. The problem, however, is that if even Gorbachev should separate from the party, give his post up as general secretary, he doesn't have enough power in the Supreme Soviet, it's still too weak a group, to implement the kinds of reforms that Gorbachev needs to do. In addition to which, when Gorbachev has introduced some legislation, for example, setting up private property, which he tried to do 2 to 3 months ago, the Supreme Soviet turned it down. So it doesn't mean, number one, that it's strong enough, and number two, that where it is strong, they don't always go along with Gorbachev. So he's still going to have his hands full.
We're going to take a break here. When we come back, we're going to talk to the first defector in the Cold War from the Soviet embassy in Washington, a lady who believes the Soviet hardliners in Moscow may be about to make a comeback.
Late one night in 19...
Welcome back. Just 24 hours after 200,000 protesters rallied outside Kremlin walls, Mikhail Gorbachev told his party's Central Committee that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's monopoly on state power must end, and he must henceforth win the support of the people. Our guests, scholar Marshall Goldman of the Russian Research Center at Harvard, and Vladimir Zvyagin, New York Bureau Chief for Soviet Television. Joining us now is Alexandra Kosta, the first Soviet to defect from the embassy in Washington since the beginning of the Cold War. She left in 1977. Ms. Kosta, you believe that the Soviet hardliners in Moscow inside the party are about to make a comeback, right?
Well, there are many indications of a conservative backlash, including the fact that it's becoming much more difficult to get exit visas. The exit department is going wild. It's all the way back to 5 years ago.
Can they make a comeback without getting rid of Mr. Gorbachev?
Hardly. But I don't think they're strong enough right now to force Mr. Gorbachev to resign.
But if they're not strong enough now, they're not going to be any stronger after they lose power under Article 6. They're not going to be any stronger after they're beaten the elections coming up in the spring. If they don't move now, it seems to me it's goodbye to the party, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it's goodbye to the party. First of all, Mr. Gorbachev is working very hard to save the party. One of the things he is trying to do is to, first of all, send a message to the party officials all over the country that they better shape up, otherwise they will be out of power. He has not come up with any specific proposals how to restructure the party, but I think this is what he's planning to do.
How does it restructure? They're going to get slaughtered in the elections, aren't they?
Not if they undertake certain PR and make-up measures. This is not Lithuania. I mean, this is the Soviet Union. They cannot separate from themselves. The only way to keep the power for the Communist Party of the USSR is to change its image and to convince people somehow that they are going to get better.
But what you're saying, it's not just idealistic, it's very contrary to what everyone else is saying. Everyone else seems to be saying the party is crumbling and Gorbachev is swimming away from the party as fast as he possibly can. You're saying he's actually building it up and that the party is stronger than ever. And you also said to someone here at CNN that Gorbachev would be weaker apart from the party than he would be within it.
That is true. As Mr. Goldman just said, Mr. Gorbachev, it would be highly premature for Mr. Gorbachev to move away from the party now, because the party still has all the power. I mean, this is a huge bureaucracy that runs the country, and the Supreme Soviet doesn't have enough power yet. Mr. Gorbachev is not moving right or left. He's still trying to stay in the center.
But Ms. Kosta, excuse me, if the party is increasingly disliked to the point of detestation by the Soviet people, doesn't it make sense for Mr. Gorbachev, if he's going to lead the country in the future, to get away from the representative of the evil old past?
Well, Mr. Gorbachev said many times, and if we believe that he is sincere, that he is a communist, and he is trying to build a better and new socialism in the Soviet Union. He is not moving towards the Western type of democracy, and that he believes in communist ideals. And the Communist Party supposedly represents them.
Let's get our other guests back in. Professor Goldman, is this idea of a right-wing comeback within the party just a paranoid nightmare of an emigre, or is there a real possibility of that?
Well, I don't know if it's just a paranoid nightmare, but you know, one of the things that's been happening, which really is quite disturbing, is that there has been a mobilization by the nationalists in the Soviet Union of the conservatives and vice versa. They've formed a United Workers Front, which is made up of the workers for the most part, infiltrated by nationalists, and they're saying stop the cooperatives, close down the cooperatives, introduce price freezes, return to central planning. They have organized, they have demonstrated. I would be fully prepared to see a demonstration comparable to what we saw yesterday, only this time with other kinds of signs. And indeed, there have been some disruptions of meetings inside the Soviet Union. So they're not gone. Ligachev may be thrown out of the party. I don't think he will be. May be thrown out of the Politburo. I don't think he will be. But those people are very strong within the Politburo. They don't have a majority, but they're pretty close.
Marshall Goldman, let me follow up with that. And I'll ask you and Mr. Zvyagin also. We've been reading reports in the New York Times elsewhere of the rising strength of Pamyat and its affiliates. Xenophobic, fiercely nationalistic, anti-Semitic, Russia first. Someone called it a mix between the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the early Nazi Party. Now, how much strength does this have, this movement, and where would it naturally align itself? With the old Bolsheviks or with the new movement, or what?
I think, Pat, if I may.
Okay, let Marshall Goldman answer after you.
Okay.
Go ahead, Vladimir.
I think that the real threat to the process of democratic reforms in the Soviet Union is not really from the conservative elements and extremist elements in the party or outside the party. It's from this fiercely nationalistic, quasi-fascist, quasi-Nazi movement like Pamit and the others, which are really anti-Semitic and anti-perestroika, anti-reform. They are not really strong today, but as you know, as we witnessed in the 30s in Germany, this can happen very, very quickly, given the empty space, which is vacuum, which is left today by the weakening structures, social and political structures across the Soviet Union.
I see Marshall Goldman nodding his head.
Yeah, I agree here. I'm no nitpicking this time. They did have candidates who ran in the election in Leningrad last March. They got a very small vote. Nonetheless, I do agree that they are causing discussion and ferment inside the Soviet Union, and as things collapse around them, collapse around Gorbachev, there is this looking for simple solutions. You know, we had something like Huey Long in the 1930s in this country, and just like Hitler rose to power with very simple solutions to very complex problems, there is this danger. They have announced a pogrom for February 19th and one for May 5th. It is a bit scary.
Okay,
Marshall,
we have to take no, excuse me, we have to take a little break, Mr. Zviagin. When we come back, I'm going to ask you, you think communism can still work with a little bit of reform. We're going to ask you how on earth. Soviet TV, you say communism is still a legitimate system. You're the last person in the world who seems to believe that. Tell us how it can work.
Michael, I think that the fathers of communism and socialism used to say that their philosophy is no dogma but a guide for political action. I firmly believe that this action has led the country to where philosophers, the forefathers, did not really want it to. It's the problem how it was implemented. And I think that communism as a political philosophy is not really dead, it's alive, and we will see it emerge as a revival very soon.
Ms. Costa, let me ask you, you said that outside of Moscow, where inside Moscow, a lot of radicals, demonstrators, anti-communists behind Gorbachev, outside of Moscow, the Communist Party is still very, very strong with the people?
Well, the people are terribly frustrated with the bosses. That is why we've seen a sort of a spate of firings in the past 5 days.
They still believe in the party and communism?
They believe in the system because they don't know any other system. And as a matter of fact, until 3 or 4 years ago, they lived reasonably well. It just got much worse in the past few years. Many of them would go back to Brezhnev's time when they could eat.
Marshall Goldman, could you follow up? Did you say a pogrom is scheduled?